Johanna.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm sharing my process of making some easy cardstock base covers. So these particular covers I made to hold my boys' completed travelers notebook inserts. So if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I've been filling out some inserts for them with photos and memorabilia from their childhood. So I have almost three completed inserts for each of them, and I decided to bind them together along with some loose drawings and artworks from like school and home. And so I knew that these books were going to end up long and narrow but also super chunky, so I decided to create a cardstock base cover as it's slightly flexible and it's just a good option for bulkiness because it doesn't add too much extra weight and it just feels nice to hold when you look through the books. So the first thing I did was get myself a rough measurement for the thickness of each book. So I put all the inserts together and I decided to make the spines about 3 inches wide. I'm using a cardboard cereal box to create my spine pieces, and I'm cutting each piece to be 5 inches wide, so that gives me enough room to make a 3-inch spine with 2 inches extra to attach to the front and back covers. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, it will as you see me put this together, but I decided to make the spine pieces separate and make them first so that I could make sure the cover was going to be able to accommodate for all of the bulk that I have in the inserts. So once I have those pieces cut, I scored 1 inch at either side of them and folded that over with a bone folder. So my paper trimmer has a scoring blade, which you see me showing you here, and that is how I scored it. So I scored 1 inch in at both sides, and that is where the front and back covers are going to attach to the spine piece. And of course I'm doing everything twice because I'm making 2 covers instead of 1, so you see me doing everything twice pretty much, but just making sure that the covers are going to fit in there and you can kind of see how that is going to fit. Next, I'm taking some fabric, so you can use any woven fabric, and I'm going to glue this onto the spine pieces to reinforce them. So the fabric is obviously very flexible and it's going to make the card a lot stronger and a lot less likely to tear or rip. I'm gluing it on with an acid-free PVA glue, and I'm spreading it on evenly all over with a brush, so that's just going to give the card a lot of extra strength. So glue the fabric over, spread it over as evenly as I can, and I do go over with my bone folder to make sure there are no bubbles or little air pockets, and just make sure that the fabric is adhered entirely over the entire piece. And then I'm going to trim off all of the extra fabric. Next, I need to create the front and back covers, and so I just do this with regular cardstock. I take 2 pieces of cardstock per cover and I fold them in half so that they have like a double weight than just a single piece of cardstock. So I measured out my inserts and I cut down the cardstock so that it's just slightly larger, so that my cover is going to be just slightly larger than all of the innards to my book. And I repeated that for both books. And then I am going to need to attach those covers to the spine pieces that you saw me create earlier. So again, using the same PVA glue, I'm going to apply it to the 1 inch excess card on the spine pieces, and then the cardstock cover will attach to it with the spine piece in the middle of the layers of the cardstock. So it makes more sense when you actually look at me doing this, but when I made these covers, I knew that I was going to be using my sewing machine to reinforce everything. So if you don't have access to one, then you will want to apply more glue more carefully than I do here in the video. In my process, I'm mostly using glue just to hold things in place so that I can sew them. But if you aren't going to use a sewing machine at all, you may also want to apply glue all over the inside of the folded card so that there's no gap between those layers. And like I said, I knew I would be sewing around all over the cover later, so to me it just didn't matter. I didn't need to apply all of that extra glue. So I used my bone folder to make sure that the covers are stuck down really well, and then once they're all stuck on, I did trim off the tiniest little excess length of the spine that was just like hanging out the top there, and then I'm going to take my entire covers through my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch around the entire border of the covers, as well as down the sides where the spine actually attached to the front and back, so just to make sure that that's never going to come away, just to give it extra reinforcement. And then you can see that we have the basic structure for the covers, and we can start to actually make them look nice, because at the moment they don't look too pretty. So I didn't film the stitching process, but you can see here, this is what it looks like when I stitched it. I didn't do it perfectly, but I did it enough so that it's going to give it more strength. So first of all, I just took some dressmaker pattern tissue paper and I ripped it and I crumpled it up, and then I'm just going to glue and collage this all over the covers to make them look and feel more textured and a little less smooth. This is also a good idea for covering over the spine piece where the cereal box is, because that is actually kind of like got a glossy finish to it, and so I want to paint these covers and paint won't stick to that gloss as well as it would to something that's more porous and more matte. So I'm not being perfect about this process at all, and any rips or wrinkles are actually really welcomed because they give it a much more interesting texture. And so I'm not folding it over the edges or anything either, I'm just bringing it over the entire cover, and then once it's done and dry, I will trim off all of the excess that's hanging off the edges. Once this is dry, I mix up some paint to paint over the entire front covers as well. I decided on brown tones, so I mixed in some red and yellow and black, and then I painted it all over the first cover, not worrying too much about brush lines or anything, as I just wanted an even layer of colour. And then I go in with a sponge to get a more even texture and to blur out any unwanted lines, so that just evens out the whole look of the paint and make sure there's no brush strokes or anything like that. And since I was low on paint for the second cover, I added more, but this time in blue, and I just mixed it in to make a slightly cooler toned brown for the second cover, and repeated the process of painting it and sponging it. So then I'm going to set the covers over to dry, and whilst they're drying I'm going to start working on the front image design. So I have these two photographs of my boys, and I'm going to use those as the focal images for the covers. And so I decided to layer them on top of some scrapbook paper, which I just trimmed down to size, and then I took the blade of my scissors around all of the edges to distress each piece, so both the scrapbook paper and the photos. So just rubbing the blade along to rough it up and to make it look more aged and distressed. I then used a few different distress ink pads to colour up the edges of the paper. So I think I used Rusty Hinge, Walnut Stain and Gathered Twigs, and I rubbed it all around the edges, and I also used a sponge to rub it over some of the papers just to make it look more aged. I also have these two old scraps of grunge paper. So this is a Tim Holtz product that kind of feels like a rubbery sort of cardstock. It's very flexible, and I wanted to incorporate some of that. So I only had two small scraps of this, so I trimmed them down so that I could have a strip of it poking out along the top and the bottom of both the photographs, and I just rounded the corners with my scissors and inked them up with more distress ink pads. So the texture of this grunge board and grunge paper is quite, like I said, it feels rubbery. It's kind of like, I guess, similar to like a leathery feel. It's definitely different to regular cardstock or paper. It has a weird texture, but it inks up really nicely with the Tim Holtz inks. Now that the covers are dry, I'm also going to take the same distress inks and I'm going to rub it around the edges of the inner covers. So I know that I'm going to be covering the inside with pattern papers later, so I only needed to add this distressed colour to the very edge of the card inside, just to cover up the bright colours like the purple and the blue of the cardstock. And I decided to add closure to these books. So I wanted to do a tie closure with some seam binding, but I wanted to do 2 ties at the top and at the bottom instead of just one in the middle, just because these books are so long and chunky. So I wanted something to hold them closed, but I thought that 2 would be better for this size and shape of book. It's kind of not really a traditional size. It's very narrow and it's very thick. So I cut 4 pieces of seam binding per book and glued the pieces to the inner covers. So I just eyeballed where these were placed and I adjusted them as I needed, but you can definitely measure it out. You just have to make sure that when the book is closed, the ties sit at about the same place because you need to be able to tie these together as the closure, so they kind of need to meet at the same spot. And again, because I was going to be using my sewing machine to reinforce these, I only applied a little spot of glue to keep them in place. But if you aren't going to be using your sewing machine, you may want to do this a lot more carefully and maybe even do some hand stitching to reinforce them or something like that. Because you're going to be using these to actually tie the book closed, you want to make sure they're really secure so they're not going to like rip out when you tie them. So I just laid out all the pieces and I had a pretty clear idea of what I was going to do. I was going to have the grunge board sitting behind the photos, and then I was going to have that on top of the paper. I just glued the grunge board pieces onto the photos behind them, and again I just used my glue to get things in place, and then I used my sewing machine to attach them more permanently. So the glue is kind of like a temporary adhesive for me. Here it's just so that they don't slip and slide when I'm sewing them, and so I can make sure everything's straight, and the stitching is what actually is going to keep it together for hopefully forever. I decided to add some eyelets to the grunge paper just so that I could have the option of adding some charms later. So I used my crocodile to add eyelets. I just put 2 eyelets on each piece, so 1 at each corner underneath the photo. So once I had the eyelets attached, I took more glue and stuck the photo pieces down on top of the pattern paper, and then again I'm going to take that through my sewing machine just so that everything's really secure. So just showing you what it looks like all stitched together. I've just stitched around the photos and left the grunge board or grunge paper unstitched, sort of so that you can lift it, so that I can add charms there later. And then I'm just placing those pieces on the front covers of the book, seeing how they fit, where I'm going to place them, and I add a little bit of glue to keep them in place, and then again take it through the sewing machine so that it's going to stay there a lot more permanently. And I do try to avoid putting glue where I know I'm going to be stitching, so all around the border of it I won't put glue there, just so that I don't have to put my sewing machine needle through it, through the gunky glue. Now that the front cover's mostly decorated, I need to go in and finish up the inside cover. So the inside cover is looking very unfinished and I need to put some pattern papers down. So I picked these galaxy sort of night sky papers for both of the books, and I just trimmed them down to size, and that's what I'm going to use to line the books. So I trimmed them into 2 pieces, and I'm not going to bother even trying to cover up the spine because it's got fabric and I don't want to add too much bulk there, and I don't want to bother around with trying to get it to sit nice. Like, it's a lot easier just to put the lining on the front and back covers, and I kind of like how the spine piece looks just with that fabric showing, so it's a lot easier just to skip that step and just line the inner covers. So that's what I'm doing. I'm using my bone folder to glue things down as best as I can. Again, I am using glue just to get it into place, and I'm going to stitch around those pieces again just so that they stay. So yeah, if you're not going to be using a sewing machine, you will want to make sure this is stuck down really, really well around the edges and try and get it as smooth as possible. I just wanted to make sure that the pieces weren't going to come off, so I just stitched around the edges. And the papers are a little bit bubbly at the end because I had to move it around my sewing machine and like kind of fold the cover, or like flex the cover over to get it around to fit it into my machine, but that's okay, it doesn't bother me. I just wanted to cover up the ugly insides, and I'm quite happy with how that turned out. Now you can see that the ties sit nicely and the pages fit in there really well, and so now I just need to add the finishing touches to the covers. I decided to add some of this lace trim to the spines, and so you could glue this on if you wanted to, but I decided to stitch it. So I just stitched it along the edges, down the side, and then I just trimmed off the excess. You can also see that I added these cute little tags at the back that says, I think it says handmade for my special little boy, and those were gifted to me from Renee. Thank you, Renee. And I've just been kind of hoarding them for something, and they were just perfect for this, so I stuck them on the back with my sewing machine. So now the covers are pretty much done, and I'm just going to show you what I've added. I've stitched all of the signatures in, so 3 inserts and 2 signatures that have paintings that my kids have done, and I also added in a couple of envelopes. I added in a little alphabet charm for each boy, so an L for Lake and a W for Wren. I also stitched on some scraps of fabric with a vintage button. So that fabric is actually scraps from some old clothes both of my boys wore. So Lake's got a piece of scrap from some shorts he used to wear all the time, and Ren's got one from a shirt he used to wear. I also added 2 eyelets on the spine, so one up the top and one along the bottom. Thread through some thread, so 3 pieces on each side, I think I did. So I took 3 pieces, folded it in half, looped it through, kind of like how you would attach thread to a tag. So I did that on both sides, and then I just tied those together just to give it a little bit of something extra, just some more kind of tactile decoration. So I used green thread for Lake's book because his favourite colour is green, and I used blue thread for Ren's book because his favourite colour is blue. And the final step is just to add a varnish. I could have done this earlier, but I did it at the end, and I just made sure that I applied the varnish everywhere that I painted, just so that the paint wasn't going to scratch off, and it just keeps it protected. It makes it easy to wipe clean, and it also gives like a little bit of extra strength to the card as well. That is the finished cover and the finished books. So I hope you liked this process video and maybe you learnt a few things. I will be doing a flip through of the finished books on my channel very soon in a separate video, so stick around if you want to see that. These books have a bunch of memories from my kids' last couple of years of life, so they're just really chock-a-block full of bits of ephemera and stories and photos. So yeah, I'm really happy with how these turned out, and I hope that you will give it a go and try and make your own cardstock cover. If you do, I would love to see them, so let me know. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you're all doing really well and that you're having a great day, and yeah, I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!